Hello, everyone. Welcome to BBELT 2025 again. In this instance, we have a fantastic panel for you. We're going to be talking about decolonial pedagogies today. And for this purpose, we have two renowned speakers to introduce to you. First off, Dr. Fernanda Vieira de Sant'Anna is a professor in the Language and Literature Department at the State University of Minas Gerais, where she's also a Research Productivity Fellow. She holds a PhD in Literature Studies from the State University in Rio de Janeiro. And Camila Farfán, who is a PhD candidate in Social Sciences and holds a Master's in Peace and Conflict Studies and a Bachelor's in Modern Languages. Her research focuses on Afro-descendant women interventions in Colombia, resistant pedagogies, and intercultural education. She has extensive experience in curriculum design, teacher training, and inclusive language teaching. So today, Fernanda is going to be talking about decolonial pedagogies with a view of language justice in EFL. And Camila is going to be talking about decolonial pedagogies in ELT with a focus on Afro-descendant women's knowledge as a tool for inclusive education. So the way in which this session is going to be structured is that we're going to hear Fernanda's presentation first, followed by Camila's presentation, and at the end, we're going to have a space for exchange. We're going to be asking some questions. We invite you to leave your questions in the chat, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion. So welcome, Fernanda, and the floor is all yours.
Hello, hola. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to salute my ancestors and my elders who paved the way so I could be here today. I would like to begin with a question that bothered me and drove me to this presentation. How can we teach English without erasing local languages and cultures? So teaching English as a foreign language, EFL, usually is entangled with histories of colonialism and linguistic imperialism, often positioning English as a dominant language at the expense of so-called minority languages. As a lingua franca, English is often positioned as a necessary tool for global communication, education, to the exchange of scientific knowledge, of economic mobility. Nonetheless, the spread of English has contributed to an extent to the marginalization of indigenous and local languages worldwide, as with the prestige and power dynamics and so on and so forth. So how can we change this reality? So instead of viewing English as a replacement language, let us explore how decolonial pedagogies and indigenous, African, Afro-diasporic, and migrant epistemologies can reshape EFL education into a space of linguistic justice. Bearing in mind that as teachers and professors, we have a pedagogical duty, but also a social responsibility towards the students and their and our communities. So linguistic imperialism. Let's discuss a little bit about linguistic imperialism, which is a concept introduced by Robert Phillipson around 1992. He argues that the dominance of English worldwide is not natural or neutral, but rather a product of historical power structures rooted in colonialism. Throughout history, European colonial powers such as Britain, Spain, and Portugal used language as a tool of control and assimilation. In Abiyala, the American continent, for example, indigenous languages were suppressed in favor of colonial languages, often through laws forbidding indigenous languages and through forced education policies and cultural repression as well. Even today, English may be perceived as the language of progress and success, while indigenous and local languages are often stigmatized as frozen in time, impractical, or irrelevant in global contexts. This absurd belief can be reinforced in EFL classrooms where English is taught monolingually ignoring students' linguistic repertoires. Teaching materials prioritize Western worldviews over local cultural narratives, and standardized English tests serve as gatekeepers to economic and educational opportunities. As a result, many students internalize the idea that their native languages and cultures are less valuable, leading to language shift and loss. However, linguistic imperialism is not inevitable, and this is where decolonial pedagogies come in. So, decolonial pedagogy is an approach that challenges dominant colonial narratives in education, drawing from scholars like Suresh Kanagaraj, Catherine Walsh, Walter Mignolo, Paulo Freire, and Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Decolonial pedagogy within EFL seeks to, among other things, critically examine power structures in language education, center indigenous and local epistemologies in teaching practices, and promote multilingualism as a tool of empowerment rather than replacement. So, how can we apply the colonial pedagogy in an EFL? So, here are three practical strategies. Translanguaging the classroom. So, instead of banning students from using their native languages, translanguaging allows them to move fluidly between English and their indigenous local languages. This reinforces cognitive development and validates their linguistic identities. And cultural differences are often seen as a problem that the school needs to solve, but in fact, they should be perceived as a pedagogical advantage, as proposed by Emília Ferreiro. 2, critical language awareness. So EFL should encourage students to critically engage with English, questioning who benefits from its dominance and who is marginalized. This can be done through discussions, analysis of media representations, and exploring non-Western English varieties such as African, Indigenous, and Caribbean Englishes. 3, community-based learning. Rather than relying solely on textbooks, students can engage with local narratives, oral traditions, and community knowledge. For example, assignments could include interviewing their elders, translating traditional stories, or analyzing local proverbs in English. So these strategies transform EFL classrooms into spaces of linguistic resistance and empowerment. But I'm adding a fourth strategy or commitment, so to speak, rethinking teacher education, changing the curriculum as well. One of the most impactful ways to resist linguistic imperialism in EFL education is by changing the curriculum itself and changing teacher education. Traditional EFL syllabi often reinforce monolinguism, and Eurocentric perspectives and linguistic hierarchies, positioning standard English as the only valuable linguistic variety, while erasing or marginalizing indigenous and local languages. And so if we are not careful, we might reinforce these ideas while training our future teachers. If you are serious about decolonizing EFL, then we need to critically revise what we teach, how we teach, and why we teach it. Now let's take a look at these principles implemented in 2 university courses dedicated to teacher education. So at Minas Gerais State University, Divinópolis unit, and the licentiate in Portuguese and English language and literature, 2 courses, 2 subjects were redesigned to integrate advocacy and decolonial pedagogy as a tool for teaching English. Both courses were taught to the same class at different times in their learning journey. So what changed? First, in the second half of 2023, the pre-intermediate English syllabus was restructured to incorporate indigenous and Afro-diasporic perspectives. Here are a few samples of the syllabus, both. Instead of focusing solely on grammar and pronunciation, lessons included discussions on indigenous literatures, climate change, Afro-diasporic and migrant literatures, identity and cultural representation. Then, on the second half of 2024, the English language conversation practice syllabus was reshaped to incorporate linguistic imperialism, translanguaging, and decolonial pedagogies, and a few theories about that. So instead of focusing solely on grammar again and teaching approaches, lessons included discussions on linguistic rights, linguistic imperialism, translanguaging, and decolonial pedagogies. In both courses, both classes, students engaged in discussions using English to raise awareness about contemporary issues and linguistic and social injustices. Students reported feeling more empowered to use English as a tool for change rather than just an academic requirement. Many expressed a renewed appreciation for their native languages, seeing them as complementary rather than inferior to English. The courses provided a model for how teaching EFL can serve broader social justice goals. And as future teachers, they felt encouraged to critically reflect on how English has been used historically as a colonial tool and how language hierarchies persist today. This leads us to consider training future EFL teachers to challenge linguistic hegemony. Teacher education programs must equip future EFL teachers with critical awareness of linguistic imperialism and strategies to promote language justice. This means revising EFL certification requirements, university syllabi, and national education policies to include courses on multilingualism, indigenous language preservation, and critical language awareness. Example, universities offering courses on decolonial EFL teaching, where future teachers design lesson plans that integrate indigenous knowledge, multilingual strategies, and advocacy-based learning. This case study demonstrates that teaching English critically with an awareness of power, history, and identity can lead to more just and equitable language structure and teacher education. In conclusion, so where do we go from here? To decolonize EFL, we must challenge monolingual, Eurocentric teaching approaches, validate and incorporate indigenous and local languages into the classroom, empower students to use English as a tool for advocacy and cultural affirmation, educate future EFL teachers to challenge linguistic hegemony and encourage critical thinking, and inspire them to continue the good fight. So language justice means recognizing that languages are systems of thought, and all languages have equal value. English should coexist with local languages, and decolonizing EFL requires both individual action, teachers, students, and systemic change, curriculum design, policy shifts. So language is how we understand the world, how we inscribe our identities in a world shaped by discourse. Language is a carrier of memory, identity, and history. And when we teach English, we must ensure that we are not contributing to the continuation of colonial patterns that have oppressed and attempted to silence resistant voices for far too long. So thank you. I look forward to your questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. Such an insightful talk on language justice in ELT. And you have highlighted the critical importance of recognizing linguistic diversity and also challenging the paradigms that shape our teaching practices and the world of ELT. So as we move forward in this conversation about decolonial pedagogies, I think it's essential that we continue to question these traditional structures in ELT, this discourse of hegemony of English, and explore ways in which we can center perhaps marginalized voices and promote inclusive practices to create really inclusive learning environments for everybody. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing what our other panelist has to say about decolonial pedagogies. And in this case, Camila is going to center on Afro-descendants women's knowledge as a tool for inclusive education. So let's welcome Camila to the floor to continue this conversation.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mariela. So, well, hello everyone. My name is Camila Farfán, and it's a honor to be here with your BBELT 2025. So, well, just a quick background. My commitment to critical pedagogy and decoloniality, is rooted with my doctoral research. So, I have had the privilege of witnessing the incredible work that Afro-descendant women in Northern Cauca carry out within their territories. So their knowledge, practices, and ways of educating serve as a powerful way of resistance and community building. That's the reason why today I want to talk about these decolonial pedagogies in ELT and how these tools can work as inclusive education. So today we will explore how these epistemologies can challenge traditional ELT pedagogies and transform language education into a more inclusive and socially just space. So this presentation is not just about integrating diverse perspective, which is, but it's also about unsettling the colonial foundations of ELT and amplifying knowledge systems that have been historically marginalized. So throughout this session, I invite you to engage and reflect on your own practices as educators. So well, let's begin. This is the agenda. The idea is to understand a little bit of the context, talk about the colonial pedagogies, and how how Afro-descendant women's knowledge work as a tool in ELT and some practical applications in the ELT setting and our classrooms, and some final reflections. So, okay, let's start. To understand why we need decolonial pedagogies in ELT, we first need to recognize the ways in which English language teaching has been shaped by colonial legacies. So ELT has historically been used used as a tool of linguistic and cultural domination. Yeah, so we have this ideal of the native speaker, of the perfect English, the perfect pronunciation. Sometimes even our systems are permeated by this idea of that a native speaker is a better teacher than local people, local teachers who speak a second language. Yeah, there is also the exclusion of non-Western knowledge and the privileging of Eurocentric linguistic norms, and that reinforces our imbalances in the classroom. So, for Afro-descendant communities, which are the communities I have been working with, as I told you at the beginning, this exclusion is particularly significant. So, many students from these communities face structural barriers to accessing quality language education, and when they do, the content rarely reflects their lived experience or cultural education. So just let me ask you, how many of your ELT textbooks include stories, voices, or knowledge from Afro-descendant or indigenous communities? So our ELT material sometimes does not depict the legacy or the cultural background, the cultural heritage that these communities might bring. So the reality is that these perspectives are largely absent, and this absence is not accidental. It is a part of a broader epistemic erasure that maintains the dominance of colonial knowledge structures. So, without representation, students are denied the opportunity to see themselves in the language learning processes, affecting motivation, also identity formation, considering that their culture, their values, their identity is not recognized, and also it affects engagement in education. Yeah. So, well, now let's talk a little bit about decolonial pedagogies. And well, you might ask, what does it mean to decolonialize education? Yeah. Because I have been talking a little bit about decolonization. So, well, there are some decolonial scholars like Catherine and Walter Mignolo. Catherine Walsh, particularly, is an U.S. scholar, and she has worked largely on Ecuadorian Latin American cultures, basically to dismantle these hierarchies and to understand that there are some colonial legacies that we still carry in our educational systems, and we keep reproducing. So Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo, as I told you, argue that it is not just about adding diverse voices, it is not just integrating this or that voice into the learning process, but about fundamentally shifting how we understand the knowledge production. Yeah. We southern countries, we used to take everything that comes from the north, yeah, in an Eurocentric perspective, and we don't value the knowledge that is produced by us and by our communities. So it is not only adding the voices, but shifting, as I told you, how we understand the knowledge production. And it requires challenging the assumption that Western ways of knowing are superior or universal. So there is another scholar which I love, and is Rita Laura Segato, and she talks about counter pedagogies and pedagogies of cruelty. And this concept of pedagogies of cruelty is particularly relevant here. Rita Laura, she argues that colonial and patriarchal system normalize violence. So there is a normalized violence that is embedded in our culture and in our structures, both like physical and epistemic, yeah, making it seem inevitable. So we are used to some forms of violence as not recognizing the other. That's one kind of violence. Minimizing or ignoring ways of knowing are types of violence. So the ELT often perpetuates this by reinforcing linguistic hierarchies and disregarding non-Western knowledge system. So when I ask you what does it mean to decolonialize education? Well, the importance of the colonial approach, on the other hand, seeks to build a counter pedagogy, another way of learning, another way of exploring knowledge. So practices that resist colonial domination and center historically marginalized knowledge. So this shift challenges educators, challenges us to reconsider what knowledge is value and whose voices are amplified in the classroom. Having said so, well, let's talk a little bit of what I have found well, in this particular experience of having the opportunity to work with Afro-descendant communities in Northern Cauca in Colombia. So, great. So Afro-descendant women have long been knowledge producers. Yeah, they have been educators and community builders. So their pedagogies are rooted in traditions, in oral traditions, embodied learning, and this intergenerational knowledge sharing. So these traditions are not only forms of resistance, but also powerful tools of language learning. So, for example, in Northern Cauca, Colombia, women lead educational initiatives, and they use storytelling, music, and art as central teaching strategies. Also, they like to explore, and they have a strong connection with their territory and their land. So, these methods not only preserve cultural heritage, but also create engaging and dynamic learning environments. So, incorporating these approaches to ELT challenges the dominance of, for example, text based or standardized learning, and makes a space for more holistic, cultural, relevant ways of engaging with language. Yeah, sometimes our curriculums are designed from, well, the Ministry of Education, and these parameters, they don't take into account the different needs that the territories needs. Like, for example, in a country like Colombia, every single department, every single community, they have their own story, their own culture. So it is very important to consider also these traditions, this knowledge, to so it can be included also when designing a curriculum and designing a learning strategy, in this case for teaching a second language. Yeah, like for example, here in this country, one of the goals of the Ministry of Education is to promote bilingualism within the next couple of years. So how are we going to do that? Yeah, if we don't integrate also local perspectives in doing so. So here are some practical applications in ELT. As I told you, okay, how do we translate this idea in concrete classroom practices? So here are some few strategies. The first one is like use storytelling as a language teaching tool. So encouraging students to share family stories or full takes. I know that you teachers are super creative, and you have lots of ideas of integrating storytelling in your classroom. That could be meaningful, especially working with some communities and in certain context. Also, it's relevant to challenge linguistic hierarchies. So, validate diverse Englishes, if we want to say so, and resist the native speaker bias. Recognize that that we non-native English speakers, we are doing an effort of speaking a second language, and it is valid also to speak our own English, using our own accents in our telling our own stories. Yeah, so validate the diverse Englishes. It's another way to resist. Yeah. As I told you, like curriculums or lesson plans, designing materials that reflect local histories and realities can also be a practice that we must or we need to include, and integrate different sorts of strategies, like for example in the ones that I told you with Afro-descendant women, with the communities I have worked with, including music, including art, including working with the land, I don't know, cultivating their land. So many Afro-descendant traditions, indigenous tradition, local traditions use rhythm, use songs, use the contact with the land, water to trees, well, with the land. So those traditions can be used to teach a language. So these are just starting points. But decolonizing ELT is an ongoing process that requires continued reflection and action. So this is not just about inclusion, it's about transformation, yeah? And it requires us to challenge dominant narratives and amplified marginalized voices. Recognize the power of community based knowledge. So, as educators, we have the responsibility to create spaces where local communities, Afro-descendant, indigenous epistemologies are not just acknowledged, but truly valued. So I leave you before we finish. I leave you with this question, and is how can we rethink our classroom and how can we rethink our classrooms as a space of resistance, justice, and liberation? Yeah. This is not a task we can accomplish alone. It is a collective effort and it requires dialogue, reflection, and the most important, action. So I invite you to take this conversation beyond this room and revisit your teaching materials. Challenge the biases within them and center the voices of those who have been historically silenced. Engage with your students, listen to their perspectives, and the most important, co-create learning experiences that reflect the diverse ways of knowing and being. Uh, and well, thank you for all your time, your engagement, and the most important, your willingness to rethink education with me today. So I look forward to your questions and to continue this important dialogue.
All right. Thank you so much, Camila, for such an interesting presentation on Afro-descendants women's knowledge as a tool for inclusive education. So you've given us a lot of thought. And now we're going to move on to the panel discussion bit of this session, where I'm going to be asking both Fernanda and Camila some questions on the topic of decolonial pedagogies. And I invite both of our panelists to interact, to comment on the different topics. And also, I'd like to invite you in the audience to leave your questions in the chat so that I can ask both Fernanda and Camila for their views on these topics.